for the passing of this bill, for this bill to be fully enacted, Mr Speaker, and I have no hesitation but to commend it to the House. Thank you.
Great speech. Mr Speaker.
I call Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Nick Smith has tried to sell this bill as a way to fix the housing crisis, but the claim just doesn't stack up. And it's so typical of much of what the Minister brings to the House, in that it's overcooked. And the bill doesn't deliver on any of the promises that the Minister made when he so fancifully organised a press conference in front of a sort of 3-metre high pile of what were allegedly RMA planning documents. And while Nick Smith has continually tinkered with the RMA over the last 8 years, and Sir, absolutely this bill that we're debating today is more tinkering, although I would characterise it as harmful tinkering because it has many negative consequences. He hasn't actually, in that 8 years in government, and after 10 years of blaming the RMA and blaming councils for expensive housing, he's done nothing substantive to tackle the real causes of expensive housing that lie within the planning system and the land use system. He's done nothing about those things, and I'm going to talk about those in detail, because let's consider the claim that Nick Smith continually makes, that the RMA is to blame for expensive housing. Sir, we only have to look at the numbers. Between 2004, the last big peak in terms of consenting rates and build rates, since 2004 into 2016, the number of consents fell by 18%, 18%, an 18% reduction in the number of consents between 2004 and 2016. The same RMA was in place, but the value of consents over that period almost doubled. So the cost of building increased by 94%. The average cost per square metre increased by 96%. Now, it's the same RMA in 2004 as in 2016. But during that time, the number of consents between the 2004 peak and the current level of building that the Minister constantly likes to brag about in this House actually fell by 18%, even though build costs doubled. And in that time, Sir, the RMA has stayed the same. So it's obvious that Nick Smith's love of blaming the RMA and blaming councils for being the overwhelming problem behind the housing crisis is just pure spin. What does this bill do to fix the housing crisis? So what does it actually do? Let's have a look. There are 3 main things that the bill does that Nick Smith claims will reduce the cost of housing. The first is that it gives draconian ministerial regulatory powers to override council plans and control consents and limit rights of people, of communities and their elected representatives to have a say in the planning process. Secondly, it gives the Minister the power to set standardised plan formats and definitions, which we don't have a problem with, but it goes much further, and that's the problem. It gives Nick Smith the power to dictate the content and the substance of the plans that are developed by local councils. It is draconian, it is Muldoonist, Sir, and we oppose it for those reasons. It also gives the Minister rule-making powers that are far, far too broad, and David Parker spoke eloquently about that earlier today. Nick Smith's impulse, his whole instinct in trying to deal with this issue, is to take powers away from councils and local communities and give them to himself. It is all about the centralisation of regulatory power in the executive arm of government, and in particular in the hands of that minister. But, Mr Speaker, this is the thing about this bill. It undermines and adds complexity to the RMA, it takes power away from citizens and their communities and their elected representatives to have a say in the planning and land use decisions in their local communities. But to dress this up as some kind of solution to the housing crisis and the failure of our biggest city to properly manage its growth is audacious in its spin, even for Nick Smith. The really crazy thing about the incessant tinkering by this minister with the RMA, and after a decade of Nick Smith and Bill English blaming councils and blaming the RMA for the problems of expensive housing and the failure to properly manage urban growth, is that all of Nick Smith's tinkering up to now and this bill do nothing to tackle the actual root causes of expensive urban land and expensive housing that lie within the planning system. The core problem is that we have a highly restrictive planning system that stops cities making room for growth. It stops them growing up and it stops them growing out. And when you do that, Mr. Speaker, only one thing happens: the prices go up. Now, there's two parts to the problem, three parts actually. One is excessive restrictions on height and density that stops cities from growing up. The second is an urban growth boundary that, even a porous urban growth boundary that can sometimes change and expand, like the one in the Auckland Unitary Plan, still rations the supply of new land for development. It drip feeds new land into a speculative land market that ensures that urban land prices are always very high. That is the core problem that we have in the urban land markets that are so much of a problem, particularly in Auckland. That is a factor of the urban growth boundary being so restrictive. And the third issue is that the system that we have in this country for financing new infrastructure for development is broken. Central government doesn't want to fund it, council can't fund it because they're up against their debt ceilings, and developers struggle to be the middleman for the finance that's needed to lay the infrastructure down for new developments. The system is broken. Now, those three issues desperately need reform, but this minister has done nothing about it. And this bill contributes nothing to fixing those three problems. All it does is tinker with the planning process and put more power in the hands of the minister and takes it away from local councils and local communities, sir. In 8 years, what has the government done about this? They like to claim responsibility for the Auckland Unitary Plan, but that's not their work. That's Auckland Council's work. And at best, that is a small incremental improvement in the problems that I've been outlining. The minister published a national policy statement that is a wasted opportunity to fix these problems. It simply put in place a bureaucratic mechanism that tells councils to drip feed incrementally bits of new land into a highly speculative land market. It does nothing to solve the core problem. And in terms of the infrastructure logjam, the best that the National Party could come up with is a $1 billion line of credit, cheap credit for councils that are already up against their debt ceiling. They are already too indebted. It's like offering a bottle of water to a drowning man. That is Nick Smith's response to the infrastructure logjam. So this, sir, does nothing to fix those problems. And by contrast, Labor has put on the table bold and creative solutions to break the logjam for infrastructure financing. We've proposed bond financing paid back by a targeted rate that is supported by the Productivity Commission. It draws on international models of best practice that would cut councils out of the picture and give developers access to the cheapest possible credit through international bond finance that would be paid back by the landowners in that development over the lifetime of the asset. So our policy is to replace the urban growth boundary completely with more intensive spatial planning that will allow cities to grow, that will allow the market in land and the construction industry to be responsive to demand, to build houses when people want them. Because the planning regime that this minister defends doesn't allow that to happen, and that is at the core of the problem we've got. This bill is draconian. It does nothing to solve the core problems that we face. It's just more tinkering by this minister.
Matt Ducey.